The strangest part, the part I keep coming back to, the part I cannot make sit still in my mind no matter how many times I turn it over, is that I never signed anything I did not believe was ordinary. I signed a marriage certificate. I signed a rental agreement for the apartment on Ladprao Road. I signed what Nalinee told me was the registration for a small household goods import business, which she said would supplement our income and give her something to manage while I was settled into retirement. I signed what she told me were the bank account opening documents for that business. I signed all of these things believing them to be what they were described to me as, and every single one of them was exactly what I was told it was, except that some of them were also other things that I was not told. And now, on the other side of all of this, on the other side of 2 Thai police interviews and a criminal lawyer's fees that consumed approximately £28,000 and a British embassy appointment at which a consular officer listened to my situation with the practiced patience of someone who had heard similar situations before and who could not, in the end, do very much about it. I am in a rented room in Norwich at the age of 62, sleeping in my sister Patricia's spare bedroom, listening to the November rain against the window, and trying to understand how a retired librarian from Norfolk became the registered director of an unlicensed lending operation that charged borrowers in the Prawet and Lat Krabang districts of Bangkok interest rates of up to 40% per month. I think the answer is simpler than I want it to be. I think it is that I was lonely, and I was trusting, and I had no framework for recognizing the specific type of risk I was being exposed to, because nothing in my life had ever equipped me to recognize it. I spent 32 years managing library collections at the Norfolk County Council. I know things about the Dewey Decimal System that I genuinely believe no other living person cares about. I know how to catalog rare manuscripts. I know the acquisition policies of the British Library well enough to have made a presentation about them at a library science conference in Cambridge in 2014. I do not know, and had never needed to know, anything about how an informal lending network operates, or how a company registration can be used to create legal liability for a person whose name appears on the founding documents, or how a foreign national in Thailand can be made criminally responsible for a business they did not know was operating under their identity. I know all of these things now. I know them in the very specific and very expensive way that people learn things they wish they had never needed to learn. I retired in 2020. My marriage had ended 8 years before that. Not dramatically, no affair, no betrayal, just 2 people who had grown into different versions of themselves and who realized, in their mid-50s, that they had been managing a comfortable coexistence rather than a marriage for probably 15 years. My daughter Emma was living in Edinburgh by then and doing well, and she and I had a good relationship despite the divorce, and I had the retirement package and the savings and the house sale to fund whatever came next. What I did not have, going into retirement during a pandemic in an empty house in Holt, was any sense of what came next or anyone to share it with. Thailand was not something I had ever particularly considered. I had been to Greece several times, Portugal once, Scotland many times because of Emma. I had never been to Southeast Asia. The idea came from a book, which is perhaps the most predictable origin story for a retired librarian who ends up somewhere unexpected. I was reading a memoir by a British man who had spent 5 years teaching English in Chiang Mai, and the world he described was so different from Holt in November that it lodged in my imagination in a way I could not entirely explain. I started reading about Thailand in the way I read about anything that interested me, which is to say systematically and at length, and by the spring of 2021 I had decided to take a 3-week trip and see what I found. I grew up in Norwich, the second of 3 children, in a family that was unremarkable in every way I was grateful for in retrospect, and found suffocating at the time. My father was an insurance clerk. My mother taught piano lessons from the front room on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. We had a small house in a quiet street, and holidays in Cromer, and a life that was organized around stability and modest comfort, in ways that felt, to me as a teenager, like an absence of adventure, and that feel now, to me at 62, like the description of a life I would exchange almost anything to have back. I went to the University of East Anglia and studied English literature, which was considered by my father a beautiful way to waste a perfectly reasonable intelligence, and then I completed a postgraduate diploma in library and information science, which my father considered a slightly less wasteful application of the English degree. I spent my entire professional life at the Norfolk County Council Library Service, progressing from assistant librarian to branch librarian to county collection manager, which is a title that sounds more important than it is, and which means, essentially, that I made decisions about which books the Norfolk County Library System would acquire and which it would retire. I was, by any measure, a specialist in a field that most people do not realize has specialists. I married Margaret in 1991. We had Emma in 1994. The marriage ended in 2014, in the manner I described. Not a collapse, but a gradual unwinding, the kind that does not produce a defining moment you can point to afterward. Margaret moved to Norwich city centre. I stayed in Holt. I saw Emma regularly when she was not in Edinburgh. The years between the divorce and retirement were not unhappy, exactly, but they had a quality that I can only describe as provisional, as though I was waiting for something to begin that was taking longer than expected to arrive. Retirement came in 2020, which was an extraordinary time to retire into silence. The pandemic locked down the country in March, and the retirement package landed in April, and I sat in my house in Holt for 6 months, watching the world through a double-glazed window, and reading more than I had ever read in my life, which for a librarian is saying something. When the restrictions eased in 2021, I had the particular hunger of someone who has been inside too long, and I booked the flight to Thailand with a decisiveness that was more about the hunger than about the destination. What I found, in the first 2 weeks, was Bangkok. I had expected to find it overwhelming, and I did, but not unpleasantly so. I had a room at a small guest house in the Ari neighborhood, which I had read was quieter than the main tourist areas, and which turned out to be true in a relative sense. Quieter than Khao San Road is not the same as quiet, but the tree-lined streets and the coffee shops and the morning market near the Victory Monument gave it a livable quality that I found, to my surprise, genuinely appealing. I walked a great deal. I visited the temples with the conscientious thoroughness of a former librarian who believes in understanding places properly. I ate street food from vendors I would have been nervous about in my first week, and that I was eating without hesitation by the third. In my second week, I met Nalinee. I met her at a Saturday market in the Chatuchak area, which I had gone to primarily because the weekend market at Chatuchak is one of the largest in the world, and I had a professional interest in the organizational systems that markets of that scale require. How you locate a specific vendor among 8,000 stalls is genuinely a cataloging problem, and I had found myself thinking about it in librarian terms from the moment I arrived. She was selling handmade jewelry at a small stall near the antiques section. She was 28, though I did not learn her age until later. She had an attentiveness about her that was not the professional attentiveness of someone trying to make a sale, but the genuine kind. The kind you notice because it is not universal. When I asked about a particular piece, she did not give me a pitch. She gave me the history of the design, where the style came from, what the material was, and why she used it. I spent 40 minutes at her stall and bought a pair of earrings for Emma, and left with the name of a restaurant near the market that Nalinee said was better than the tourist options on the main road. I think I want to say something honest about what followed over the next 14 months, because I think the honest version is the only version that is useful to anyone watching this. I was not swept off my feet in a dramatic way. I was not the man in the cautionary tale about an older Western man and a younger Thai woman who loses his judgment entirely in the heat of infatuation. What happened was slower and more ordinary than that, and in some ways more embarrassing, because the thing that made me vulnerable was not romantic passion. It was the simple relief of not being alone. We had coffee twice in the third week of my visit, and then dinner once before I flew home, and we exchanged messages with increasing frequency after I returned to Holt. I came back to Bangkok in September 2021, and again in January 2022. By the January visit, I was spending most evenings with Nalinee, and beginning to think about what a longer stay would look like. She was steady and warm and interested in me as a person in a way that I found I had been missing, specifically that particular quality of being known by someone, the way she remembered things I had mentioned months earlier and referred back to them, the way she asked about Emma by name, the way she seemed to find my librarian-specific interests genuinely more interesting than tedious. I realize now that these were skills deployed deliberately. I did not realize it then because I had not had enough experience of them being deployed deliberately to recognize the difference between the real thing and a very good performance of the real thing. There was a conversation in the January visit that I have returned to many times since, not because it contained any overt warning, but because of what I failed to hear in it. We were at a restaurant near the apartment she was renting in the RE area at the time. A small place, 2 tables outside under an awning, the BTS line visible over the rooftops, and she mentioned that her family had been involved in informal finance for many years. She said it matter-of-factly, in the way people mention family occupations that are ordinary to them. Informal finance was how she described it. I asked what that meant. She said it was the kind of lending that helped people who could not access banks, the kind of community support that had existed in Bangkok for generations, she said, and that was different from how it was sometimes portrayed. She said her grandmother had started it, and her parents had continued it, and it was simply part of how the family operated. I remember thinking that this was interesting, a form of community banking that existed below the formal financial system, and that it said something characteristically resourceful about Thai family networks. I did not think anything else. I should have thought something else. I met Ian at a Thursday evening gathering of British expats at a bar near the Asok BTS station in February, during my January-February visit. Ian was 54, had been in Bangkok for 7 years, worked in export logistics, and had the specific knowledge base of someone who had lived through several versions of the expat experience in Thailand, and had developed clear views on most of the subjects that came up. We talked for about an hour at that first meeting. He asked about my situation in the direct way of a man who has watched enough similar situations to have formed opinions about the early stages. When I told him I was in a relationship with a Thai woman and was considering moving to Bangkok, he asked a series of questions that were, I understand in retrospect, a diagnostic rather than a conversation. How long had I known her? Had I met her family? Had any money been asked for or given? Had I seen where she lived? What did I know about her work and her family's work? I answered all the questions honestly. He listened without obvious judgment, and then said, carefully, the lending thing, the family business. Did she give you any more detail about what that involves? I said she had described it as informal community finance. Ian said, right. He said it in the way that a word can function as a complete sentence. I asked what he meant. He said he was not trying to alarm me, that community lending was a real thing in Bangkok and existed on a spectrum, but that the spectrum had ends that were very different from each other, and it was worth understanding which end of the spectrum before getting more involved. I said I would ask her more about it. I did not ask her more about it. I moved to Bangkok in April 2022. Looking back, I think the speed of this decision is the thing that most clearly reflects my state of mind at the time. I had been a cautious person my entire life, methodical, careful, the kind of man who read the full terms and conditions, and kept important documents in labeled folders. The decision to move to Bangkok was not made methodically. It was made with the urgency of someone who had found something they were afraid to lose, and who was willing to move faster than their usual speed to secure it. I told Patricia in March that I was moving. She said, Alvin, are you sure? I said I was sure. She said, you've known her less than a year. I said I understood that, but that I was 60 years old, and I had been careful all my life, and it had not made me particularly happy, and that I was going. I said it with more confidence than I had ever said anything that was primarily driven by feeling rather than reason. The apartment on Ladprao Road was Nalinee's choice. She said the neighborhood was well located and affordable, and that several of her family members lived nearby, which turned out to be correct in ways I did not fully appreciate at the time. We married in June 2022. I signed the registration at the district office in Ladprao and attended a family dinner that included a very large number of people who were apparently Nalinee's relatives. The warmth with which they received me, the particular kindness of her mother, who could not speak English, but who patted my hand repeatedly in a way that I found genuinely touching, and which, I now think, I should have been less moved by. I remember being happy at that dinner. I remember the specific feeling of it, the contentment of a man who has arrived somewhere he has been looking for. I think it was real at the time. I think a great deal of what I felt was real at the time. I also think that what was real and what was being constructed for my benefit were not entirely separable, and that this is the most complicated part of the whole thing to make peace with. The business registration came in August. Nalinee said she wanted to set up a small import business. Household goods, she said. The kind of practical domestic products that were cheaper to source from China than to buy locally in Bangkok. She had connections from the market trading, she said. Suppliers she had worked with for years. She said having a registered business would help with our tax situation and also give her a productive occupation while I settled into the Bangkok life. All of this was plausible. None of it was what was actually happening. I signed the company registration documents in August. I signed what I was told were the associated bank account opening forms in September. I signed a director's declaration, the document that establishes the legal officers of a Thai company, in October, without understanding precisely what a director's declaration meant in terms of legal liability in the Thai corporate system. This is the central ignorance of my story. I signed the director's declaration, believing it was an administrative requirement for registering a small household goods import business. And what it was registering me as director of was a legal entity that was being used, within weeks of my signature, to conduct unlicensed money lending operations in the Prawet and Lat Krabang districts of Bangkok. The months of October, November, and December 2022 had a quality that I notice more in retrospect than I did at the time. Nalinee became less present, not in a way I would have characterized as worrying, but in the way that a person becomes less present when they have more demands on their attention. She was starting the business, she said, and it required a great deal of coordination with suppliers and logistics contacts. She spent more evenings on her phone, usually in the other room. She was at home when I went to sleep, but sometimes gone when I woke up. And she explained this as early meetings with suppliers whose schedules matched better in the morning hours. None of this was impossible. None of it was outside the range of behavior a busy new business operator might exhibit. It was simply different from how she had been before the business registration was signed. In November, the family visits increased. The people who came to the apartment, uncles, cousins, people described as childhood friends, did not come at the times or with the ease of casual social visitors. They came at specific hours and left quickly, and the conversations were conducted in the kitchen or on the balcony, and were not translated for me, except in summary form. When I asked Nalinee what these conversations were about, she said, business logistics, family who were helping with the distribution network, the contacts she had mentioned when describing the business plan. I accepted this. I was not a suspicious man by nature, and I had no framework within which this specific pattern of behavior, the brief visits, the hushed conversations, the exact hours, could be recognized as the coordination of an unlicensed lending operation. I had a framework for cataloging manuscripts. I did not have a framework for this. There was one evening in January 2023, this was about 3 months before Ian called, when I overheard a phone call that Nalinee was taking on the balcony. She was speaking Thai, which I had not managed to learn beyond greetings and basic courtesies, and the call went on for about 20 minutes. I could hear the tone without understanding the words, and the tone was different from her usual register, more clipped, more transactional, with pauses that suggested she was taking notes or instructions rather than having a conversation. I heard her say my name once, or I thought I heard my name, or the Thai syllables that sounded close enough to my name that I noticed them. When she came back inside, I asked who had called. She said it was a supplier, that there had been a delivery issue. She looked me in the face when she said it, and the look was entirely composed, and I believed her and went to bed. And I think about that moment now quite often. In February, there was a small incident with the bank that I noted and then set aside in the way I had been setting things aside since October. The business account had received a notification that unusually high transaction volumes had triggered an automated review. Nalinee showed me the notification on her phone. She showed it to me, which seemed at the time like transparency, and said it was because she had been processing a lot of supplier payments in the first quarter, and the bank's system had flagged it as unusual. She said she would call the bank to clarify. I said that seemed sensible. I did not call the bank myself. I do not have a satisfying explanation for why I did not call the bank myself, except that I was not the kind of person who checked things independently when someone I trusted had offered to handle them. I had trusted people for 60 years, and it had generally worked out. This was the exception that the rule produced. Looking back now, I can trace the shape of what was happening during those months of late 2022 and early 2023, in ways that were not available to me while I was inside it. The family members I had thought of as aunts and uncles and cousins at the June wedding dinner were not simply family members. They were participants in a lending network that had been operating in some form for at least 15 years, according to what Kun Narong later established. The network operated by making short-term loans, typically between 5,000 and 50,000 baht, to working-class borrowers in the outer Bangkok districts, at interest rates that were both illegal and genuinely ruinous for the people paying them. The borrowers were often people with no access to formal banking credit: motorcycle taxi drivers, market vendors, domestic workers. The interest rate of 40% per month meant that a 10,000 baht loan, approximately 220 pounds, cost the borrower 4,000 baht in interest alone each month. Miss a payment, and the rates compounded. The enforcement mechanisms, which Kun Narong described to me in terms I found difficult to absorb, were not gentle. The business account opened in September with my signature was used to process a portion of the loan repayments. Not all of them. The network used multiple accounts and multiple payment channels, some informal, but enough that when the bank's fraud detection systems flagged unusual patterns of high-frequency small transactions and filed a report with the Police Financial Crimes Unit in March 2023, the account in question was registered to the company of which I was the named director. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, not from the bank, from Kun Narong, who was not yet my lawyer because I did not yet know I needed one. The call came from Ian, a British man I had met through an expat group that met monthly at a restaurant near the BTS Asok station, who had somehow heard through the expat network that there was a foreign national connected to a financial crimes investigation in Ladprao. Ian called me directly and said, "Alvin, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Do you have any involvement in a lending business?" I said I had signed the paperwork for Nalinee's import business. Ian was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "How much of the paperwork did you read?" I said I had read the parts that Nalinee translated for me. Ian said, "Oh, Alvin, I want to describe the hours that followed that call, because I think the specific texture of acute shock is different from what people expect, and different from what I had imagined it would feel like." I did not panic. I did not cry. I sat at the kitchen table of the apartment on Ladprao Road, and I felt something that I can only describe as a progressive draining, as though something that had been animating me was slowly being extracted. I was aware of the sounds from the street below, the motorbike taxis, the food vendor's cart, the particular sound of Bangkok mid-morning traffic that I had come to find, over the preceding 9 months, something close to familiar. I remember there was a half-drunk cup of tea on the table that I had made before the call, and had not finished, and I remember thinking that it had gone cold. After I sat for a while, I went to the window. The street below Ladprao Road was doing what it always did in the mid-morning. The delivery motorcycles, the woman who sold papaya salad from a cart on the corner, the man who repaired mobile phones at a folding table outside the 7-Eleven. Everything was exactly as it had been the day before and the day before that. The world outside was entirely unchanged. Only the world inside, my understanding of it had shifted, or had begun shifting, in the way that large shifts begin, not as a single moment, but as the first movement of a gradual recalibration that takes days or weeks to complete. I thought about the paperwork. I went to the labeled folder, the librarian's folder, organized by category and date, and I took out the company registration documents, and the bank account forms, and the director's declaration, and I laid them on the kitchen table, and I looked at them for a long time. They were in Thai. I could not read them. I had never been able to read them. I had read the English summaries that Nalinee had provided, and I had believed the summaries were complete. I looked at the Thai characters and I thought, everything that matters is in here, and I do not know what it says, and I should have known what it said before I signed it. and I did not find out, because finding out would have required me to doubt the person I trusted, and I could not bring myself to doubt her. I sat there with the documents in front of me, and I understood, in the specific and irreversible way that understanding arrives when it can no longer be deferred, that I had signed my name to something I had never read. Nalinee was not in the apartment. She had left early, she said, to visit her mother. She had been leaving early to visit her mother with increasing frequency over the preceding month, which I had noticed and attributed to her mother being unwell. I called her number 4 times. It went to voicemail 4 times. I sent a WhatsApp message. It showed as delivered, but not read. By the evening it showed as read, but she did not respond. I have not spoken to Nalinee since the morning of the day Ian called me. Ian came to the apartment that afternoon. He brought a name, Kun Narong, a criminal defense and commercial law attorney in Bangkok, with experience handling cases involving foreign nationals. Ian said, "You need a lawyer before you need anything else." I called Kun Narong. His office was on Sathorn Road, and he agreed to see me the following morning. Kun Narong spent 90 minutes with me on that Wednesday morning. He was methodical and thorough, and he told me things that I could only absorb partially, the way you absorb information when the information is too consequential to fit into the mental framework you have been using to understand your own life. He said the company was registered with me as director. He said the bank account showing the loan repayment transactions was in the company's name. He said under Thai corporate law, a director of a company bore legal responsibility for the company's operations, unless they could demonstrate they had no knowledge of and no involvement in the activities in question. He said demonstrating this in a criminal investigation context was a process that would require time, documentation, and significant legal work. He said the police had not yet formally summoned me, but that this was likely to happen within weeks, and that arriving at that summons with counsel already engaged was substantially better than arriving without it. He asked me to bring every document I had signed since arriving in Thailand. I went back to the apartment, and I found the folder where I kept important papers, the labeled folder, the librarian's folder, which contained the marriage certificate and the apartment lease, and the company registration documents, and the director's declaration, and the bank account forms. I put them all in a bag. I remember I also put in the bag a biography of Samuel Pepys that I had been reading, which I had no reason to bring to a lawyer's office, and which was still in the bag when I got home that evening, which I found, in the weeks that followed, oddly comforting, in a way I could not rationally justify. The police interview happened in May. Kun Narong prepared me over several sessions. The interview was conducted in Thai with Kun Narong translating in real time, and it lasted 3 hours and 20 minutes, and it covered in detail every document I had signed, every conversation I had had with Nalinee about the business, every transaction I was aware of in the company account. The officer conducting the interview was professional and not unkind. He had, I suspect, interviewed foreign nationals in similar situations before. At one point he asked me, in a way that Kun Narong translated carefully, whether I had known the business was conducting unlicensed lending. I said I had not. He made a note. I do not know what he wrote. The investigation continued for 4 months after the interview. Kun Narong kept me informed of developments as he was able to. The conclusion, reached in September 2023, was that there was insufficient evidence to establish my direct knowledge of or participation in the lending operations, and that the case against me personally would not proceed. This was the outcome Kun Narong had told me in May, was the most likely outcome if the documentation established what he expected it to establish. It was nevertheless a conclusion I did not fully believe was coming until it came, and the relief of it was so complete and so physical that I sat in Kun Narong's office on Sathorn Road, and, for the first time since the Tuesday morning with the cold cup of tea, I wept. The financial accounting, which I did not have the emotional capacity to conduct until after the investigation closed, was this. The company account had processed approximately 4.2 million baht in transactions over the 6 months it was active, though the actual profit to the lending operation was a fraction of this. The bulk was loan principal cycling through. My direct financial loss from the situation included Kun Narong's fees of approximately £28,000, The income I had been unable to generate in any form while the investigation was ongoing, and the loss of the apartment deposit when I terminated the lease in October 2023. I had also, during the marriage, transferred approximately £67,000 to Nalinee across various requests. For the business startup costs she described, for household expenses, for family situations she reported as needing urgent resolution. In total, across 20 months of marriage and the legal proceedings that followed, I had spent £148,000 that I was not going to recover. Not a complete loss of my assets, but more than one-third of what I had arrived in Thailand with. I left Bangkok in October 2023. I packed the labeled folders and the books and a few things that had accumulated over 20 months, and I did not pack the jacket I had bought for the wedding. I left it in the wardrobe. I do not know why I mention this, except that it seemed, at the time, like the right thing to leave. Patricia met me at Norwich Airport. She did not say "I told you so," which she was entitled to say and did not, which is the kindness of a sister who has watched you make a decision she was against, and has decided that the decision's consequences are sufficient without adding to them. She made me a cup of tea and asked if I was hungry. I said I was not. She made me dinner anyway. I think I am still, in some sense, eating that dinner. There are things I understand now that I want to say as plainly as I can, because plain is the only useful register I have left for any of this. I understand that a company director in Thailand carries legal liability for the company's operations regardless of whether they were present for or aware of those operations, and that this liability is not theoretical but practical and potentially criminal, and that this fact should be understood by anyone who is asked to sign founding documents for any Thai company before they sign them, not after. The director role is not a formality. It is a legal exposure. Have an independent attorney review every founding document before you sign, not the attorney recommended by the person asking you to sign. Specifically, engage a bilingual Thai commercial lawyer who you have found and retained yourself, who has no prior relationship with the person presenting the documents, and ask them to explain, in English, what legal role and liability each document creates for the signatory. This should happen before you pick up the pen. It cost me £28,000 in legal fees to undo the consequences of not doing this. The independent attorney consultation would have cost approximately £200. I think about this ratio often. I understand that an informal lending business, what is sometimes called a nakon luang operation, or more broadly an unlicensed loan operation, is not an unusual feature of the Bangkok financial landscape. It is common, it has been common for generations, and it exists because a significant portion of the Bangkok working population has no access to formal banking credit and needs short-term liquidity that the formal system will not provide. This does not make it legal. The Thai Credit Information Business Act and the Financial Institutions Business Act together create a clear regulatory framework for lending, and operating outside that framework is a criminal offense. A foreign national registered as director of a company conducting such operations is exposed to criminal liability in Thailand, under statutes I did not know existed until Kun Narong explained them to me in his office on Sathorn Road. The fact that I did not know they existed did not protect me from them. I understand that the warning Ian gave me in February 2022 about the spectrum of community lending and the importance of understanding which end of it Nalinee's family was on, was a sufficiently clear signal that I should have acted on it immediately. I should have asked Nalinee directly and specifically, is this operation licensed? Is it registered with the Bank of Thailand? Are the interest rates charged compliant with the legal maximum? These are specific, answerable questions. I did not ask them. I asked instead a vaguer and more comfortable version of the question. Are you sure this is all above board? And received a vaguer and more comfortable answer. And I accepted that answer, because asking the specific questions would have required me to believe, even momentarily, that the person I loved might be doing something seriously wrong, and I was not willing to believe that. I understand that when a person asks you to sign documents in a language you cannot read, and when the translation they provide is the only access you have to what the documents say, the risk you are taking is not simply the risk that the translation is wrong. The risk is that the translation is selectively accurate. that it tells you what the document does in certain respects while not telling you what it also does in other respects. This is what happened to me. The company registration form was accurately described as a company registration form. The bank account forms were accurately described as bank account forms. The director's declaration was described as an administrative requirement. The combination of these documents, and what that combination enabled, was not described at all. I signed each of them as what I was told they were, and they were what I was told they were, and they were also other things I was not told. The only protection against this is independent translation and independent legal review, both arranged by you and paid for by you, before anything is signed. I understand that I do not know with certainty the full extent of what Nalinee knew and planned when she married me, or when she first met me. I have thought about this question in the way I used to think about difficult research questions in the library, following every available thread of information and accepting the uncertainty that remains when the threads run out. I know that the lending network pre-existed our relationship. I know that my name on a company registration was useful to the network in ways that were planned rather than opportunistic. I do not know whether the warmth I experienced from her was entirely performance, or whether some of it was something else that coexisted with the calculation. I have decided that not knowing it is a thing I have to live with, rather than a mystery I will resolve. I am back in Norfolk now, Patricia's spare room in Norwich, which is very quiet, and which has a window that faces a garden, where a robin has been visiting the same spot on the lawn every morning since I arrived. I am 62 years old, and I have £237,000 remaining of the £385,000 I came to Thailand with, and the pension that begins fully in 3 years, and a brother-in-law who has been very decent about my presence in the house, and who does not ask questions I cannot answer. I do not know what comes next. I think this is the most honest thing I can say. I do not know what comes next, and I have stopped pretending that I do. If there is something useful in any of this for anyone watching, I hope it is this. The most dangerous documents you will ever be asked to sign are not the ones that look important. They are the ones that look routine. The ones that arrive in a stack with other forms. The ones where someone says, "This is just the standard registration. This is just for the bank. This is just a formality. Would you mind just signing here?" The word "just" is the word that should stop you every time. Just is doing a great deal of work in sentences like that. Just is never just. The robin was on the lawn again this morning. I watched it for a while. I do not know what happens next. There is one more thing I want to say about the specific loneliness that produces the kind of vulnerability I had. People talk about loneliness as though it were a simple condition, a straightforwardly negative state that a person either has or does not have. What I experienced in the years between Margaret and Thailand was something more complicated than that. I was not without people. I had Patricia, I had Emma, I had colleagues and acquaintances, and the particular mild sociability of a small-town library professional who is known and liked by the community he serves. What I lacked was someone who was specifically interested in me, in the interior version of me, in the thoughts I had that were more than the professional competence, or the family role, or the social ease. Nalinee produced the sensation of that specific interest, consistently and convincingly, across 14 months. I think that is what I was paying for with the £148,000, without knowing I was paying. I was paying to feel, for 14 months, like someone's specific and chosen person. I think about whether that was worth anything. I think about it quite a lot. It probably was not worth £148,000. But I am not sure the accounting is as simple as it looks. The robin was on the lawn again this morning, the same spot. I do not know what it is looking for. I do not know what comes next for me either. Some days that is frightening. Some days it just is. Perhaps that is where I leave this. Not with a warning, not with a lesson, but with a robin on a lawn, and a question I cannot answer, and a Thursday morning in Norfolk that is, at least, mine. And that, for now, is enough. At least, I hope it is. I genuinely do not know. The morning light in Norwich is different from Bangkok light, quieter, more gray, more familiar than I remembered, and more welcome than I expected it to be.